On a cold and restless night across the plains of Texas, rancher Caleb Turner had made camp beside a dry creek bed not far from Abilene. The land around him stretched wide and empty under a sky filled with sharp, distant stars. His herd of 80 cattle rested in a loose circle nearby, their quiet breathing rising into the cool night air. It should have been a peaceful moment, the kind of silence that many men on the frontier welcomed after a long day of work. But Caleb had lived too many hard years to trust quiet nights. His bedroll lay beside the fading fire, and his rifle rested within easy reach. Even while resting, he kept his boots on. The frontier had taught him that danger rarely announced itself with noise. Sometimes trouble came softly, like wind moving through dry grass. The fire was nearly dying when Caleb sensed something unusual. At first, it was only a feeling, something different in the darkness beyond the edge of the firelight. The cattle were calm, and there were no sounds of coyotes or rustling brush. Whatever moved out there was slow and careful. His hand moved toward his rifle before he even turned his head. Then he saw her. Standing just outside the glow of the fire was a woman. She kept enough distance to avoid stepping into his camp without permission, but she was close enough that it was clear she had been watching him for a moment. The sight surprised Caleb. Women did not wander alone across cattle country at night. Her dress had once been gray but was now faded and stained with dust from travel. The hem was torn from long miles of walking. Her boots were cracked and coated with dried mud, and a small carpet bag hung from her wrist like the last possession she owned. Strands of brown hair had slipped loose from their pins, framing a thin face shaped by hunger and exhaustion. Yet there was something else in her expression that caught Caleb's attention. Pride. Even though she looked tired enough to collapse, she did not beg or plead. She simply stood there and waited. Caleb kept his rifle lowered but ready. "You lost?" he asked. The woman lifted her chin slightly. "No." The wind moved quietly between them, stirring the ashes of the dying fire. "Then what are you doing out here alone?" he asked again. For a moment she hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. Caleb noticed a small tremor in her hands, though her voice remained steady when she finally spoke. "May I warm up by your fire?" she asked. "Just until dawn." It was a simple question, spoken without drama or tears. Yet in that moment, the request carried weight far greater than the words themselves. Caleb steadied her the same way he would steady a nervous horse, watching for signs of danger or dishonesty. But he saw none. What he saw instead was exhaustion and a stubborn strength that refused to disappear, even after hardship. Without saying yes directly, he poured coffee into a spare tin cup and placed it on the ground between them. "If you mean trouble," he warned, "you picked the wrong camp." "I don't mean trouble," she answered quietly. Only then did she step closer into the firelight. Up close, Caleb noticed something else. On her left hand was the pale mark where a wedding ring had once been worn. It was the kind of mark that told a story without words. The woman crouched near the fire but stayed a careful distance from him. She took the cup with both hands, as if afraid the warmth might vanish if she held it loosely. "What's your name?" Caleb asked. "Clara," she replied. He nodded once. "Caleb." For a while they sat in silence while the cattle shifted in the darkness and the night stretched wide above them. Neither of them knew it yet, but that small question, asked in a tired voice beside a dying fire, would change both of their lives before the sun rose again. The fire burned a little brighter after Caleb Turner added another stick of mesquite wood. Sparks rose into the dark sky and faded among the stars. The cattle shifted slowly in the night, their hooves scraping dry earth as they settled again. Across the fire sat Clara, holding the tin cup of coffee between both hands as if it were the only warm thing left in the world. For a while, neither of them spoke. Caleb had spent years on cattle drives, and he knew that silence often told more truth than questions. A person who had walked alone across miles of ranch country at night carried a story. But forcing it out rarely helped. So he simply watched the fire and waited. Clara stared into the flames as if gathering courage. Finally, she spoke. "I was supposed to be married last week." Her voice was calm, but the words carried a quiet weight. Caleb did not interrupt. He had learned that when someone began telling the truth, it was best to let them finish in their own way. My father owed money, she continued. The man I was to marry expected $200 as part of the dowry. She paused for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup. We couldn't pay it. The wind drifted across the plains, lifting bits of ash from the fire and carrying them into the darkness. They called off the wedding, Clara said quietly. Right there in front of everyone. She gave a small breath that was not quite a laugh. I suppose it was easier for them that way. A woman without a dowry is considered less useful. Caleb's eyes moved briefly toward the pale mark on her left ring finger. Now the story behind it made sense. What happened after that? He asked. Clara watched a spark fade in the night air. The landlady told me I couldn't stay in my room anymore, she said. She said it would look improper for a woman whose wedding had failed to live there alone. Her voice remained steady, but the bitterness beneath the words was clear. So I packed my things and left. You just started walking? Caleb asked. She nodded slowly. I didn't know where else to go. The fire popped softly as another piece of wood split under the heat. To where? Caleb asked. Clara shrugged faintly. Anywhere that wasn't there. The honesty of the answer hung in the quiet air between them. For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. He understood the feeling more than he cared to admit. The frontier was full of people running from something, failed farms, broken families, bad decisions, or grief they didn't want to face. He studied Clara again, noticing details he hadn't seen at first. Her hands were rough, not soft like someone who had never worked. There were small calluses across her palms and fingers. Her posture, even after miles of walking, remained straight and steady. This was not a helpless woman. You ever worked cattle? Caleb asked suddenly. Clara looked up in surprise. Yes. Milk cows? He asked. She nodded. And I can ride. I grew up on a farm. Caleb leaned back slightly, thinking. He had planned to reach the rail station in Hayes in about 4 weeks. Driving 80 head of cattle that distance alone was difficult work. Normally he would hire another hand before starting a drive, but this time there had been no one available. He looked again at Clara's worn boots and blistered hands. I'm short a hand, he said at last. She watched him carefully, unsure what he meant. For weeks' drive to the rail station, Caleb continued. $1 a day in meals. You work, you earn it. He paused before adding firmly. No charity. Clara didn't hesitate. Yes, she said immediately. Her answer came so quickly that Caleb almost smiled. It sounded less like acceptance and more like relief. He pointed toward the far side of the camp. You sleep there, he said. We move at first light. Clara nodded. She didn't thank him. But when she wrapped the spare blanket around her shoulders and lay down beside the fire, something in her posture changed. For the first time in days, she slept without the fear of being driven away again. And somewhere in the quiet of the night, the path of two very different lives had begun to join. The sun rose slowly over the wide plains the next morning, spreading pale gold light across the open land near Abilene. The cool night air faded as warmth crept across the grass and dry soil. Around the small camp, the herd of cattle began to stir, their low breaths turning into slow movement as they stood and stretched after the night. When Caleb Turner opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was the smell of fresh coffee. For a moment he lay still, surprised. Usually on a cattle drive he woke before anyone else, especially when he was working alone. But when he lifted his head slightly, he saw Clara crouched near the fire. She had already rebuilt it. The blue-dented coffee pot sat over the flames, gently steaming. A small iron skillet warmed beside it. Clara moved carefully, her tired body stiff from sleeping on the ground, but she worked with quiet determination. When she noticed Caleb watching her, she gave a small nod. Figured I'd start earning that $1, she said. Caleb pushed himself up and sat on his bedroll. For a moment he studied her without speaking. In all his years on the trail, he had seen plenty of hired hands. Some were lazy. Some complained before the sun even rose. But Clara had begun working before he even woke. He stood and poured himself a cup of coffee. "Good," he said simply. After a quick meal of cornmeal and coffee, they began preparing the herd. The cattle were restless, shifting in loose circles while the morning wind moved across the plains. Caleb saddled his strongest horse, while Clara mounted an older mare he trusted for calmer riding. Before they started, Caleb explained her position. "You ride the left flank," he said. "Keep the strays from drifting too far." Clara nodded carefully, repeating the instructions in her mind. Soon the herd began moving north, their hooves creating a steady rhythm across the dusty ground. 80 head of cattle was not a small drive for two people, and Caleb knew the work would test anyone who wasn't prepared. Dust rose into the air as the animals walked, coating clothes, skin, and hair. The sun climbed higher, and the heat began to press down on the land. Clara stayed exactly where Caleb told her to ride, watching the outer edge of the herd carefully. The work was harder than it looked. Cattle rarely walked in perfect lines. They drifted, hesitated, or suddenly tried to wander away from the group. Every moment required attention. By mid-morning, Caleb began to notice something important. Clara wasn't falling behind. Her posture in the saddle was steady, and her eyes remained focused on the herd. She didn't panic when cattle shifted. She simply adjusted her horse and guided them gently back into place. Then the real test came. One of the red brindle cows suddenly lifted its head and bolted away from the herd, kicking dust behind it as it ran. New hands often made mistakes in moments like this. Some froze in confusion. Others chased the animal directly, which only made it run faster. But Clara did neither. She leaned forward and urged her mare into motion, cutting across the dust instead of following behind the cow. Her hat nearly flew off in the wind as she guided the horse at an angle. Within seconds she had moved ahead of the runaway animal. Instead of shouting or whipping her horse wildly, she calmly shifted her position, blocking the cow's path and turning it slowly back toward the herd. The animal hesitated, then drifted back into the moving group. When Clara returned to her position, her breathing was heavier, but her expression remained calm. Caleb watched her for a moment before speaking. "Good cut," he said. It was the first real praise he had given her. Clara simply nodded and continued riding. By afternoon, the long hours of work had begun to take their toll. Dust coated her face and hands, and the rope work had already begun tearing open small blisters across her palms. But she didn't complain. She didn't ask for rest. She simply continued riding beside the herd, mile after mile. Somewhere between the first mile and the 50th, something subtle began to change between them. It wasn't friendship yet. It wasn't trust either. But it was something close to recognition. Two people who had spent long years surviving alone were now riding side by side beneath the same wide sky. And though neither of them said it aloud, both had begun to realize that this journey might become more than just a cattle drive. By the third day on the trail, Caleb Turner realized something important about Clara. She wasn't going to quit. The morning sun rose bright and harsh over the open plains near Abilene, and the air quickly filled with heat and dust. The herd of 80 cattle moved slowly across the dry ground, their hooves pounding the earth in a steady rhythm that never seemed to stop. Clara rode along the left flank just as Caleb had instructed, keeping a careful eye on the outer edge of the herd. Her back remained straight in the saddle, though the long hours of riding had already left her shoulders sore. The rope burns on her hands had opened into painful blisters, and every time she tightened her grip on the reins, the sting reminded her how hard the work truly was. Still, she said nothing. Around mid-morning the sky began to change. At first it was only a dark line along the horizon, a slow gathering of clouds that thickened as the hours passed. The wind shifted direction, carrying a heavy smell that ranchers knew well. A storm was coming. Caleb noticed it immediately. Years of driving cattle had taught him how quickly weather could turn dangerous on the plains. Keep them tight, he called across the wind. Clara nodded and rode wider along the herd's edge, guiding drifting cattle back into place before they could wander too far. The animals themselves could feel the change in the air. Their ears flicked nervously, and their movements grew restless. Thunder rolled in the distance. Then lightning split across the sky. The bright flash struck somewhere beyond a low ridge, and the crack of thunder followed only seconds later. The herd panicked. 80 frightened cattle began running at once, their hooves pounding like thunder across the ground. Dust exploded into the air as the animals surged forward blindly. A stampede had begun. Caleb spurred his horse forward, shouting commands and trying to push the herd inward to control their direction. But once panic started among cattle, stopping it quickly was nearly impossible. Across the herd, Clara saw the chaos unfold. She guided her mare into the rushing movement, shouting now as she tried to bend the animals back toward the center. Wind whipped her hair loose from its pins while rain began falling in cold, heavy drops. Then she saw something that made her heart jump. A small calf had fallen. Its legs were tangled beneath its body, and it struggled desperately to stand while the rest of the herd rushed around it like a river around a stone. "Leave it!" Caleb shouted through the storm. "We'll lose the whole herd." But Clara couldn't ignore what she saw. If the calf stayed where it was, the stampede would crush it within seconds. Without stopping to think, she pulled her mare to a sudden halt and jumped from the saddle. The ground shook beneath her feet as cattle thundered past on both sides. Dust and rain blurred her vision, and the noise was so loud it swallowed every other sound. She rushed toward the struggling calf and dropped to her knees beside it. The animal kicked weakly, frightened and confused. It was heavier than it looked, and mud slicked its legs as Clara tried to lift it upright. "Clara!" Caleb shouted again somewhere behind her. But she couldn't answer. Using every bit of strength she had, she pulled the calf onto its feet and wrapped her arms around its body. The herd pressed dangerously close around her, horns and hooves passing only inches away. A sudden jolt struck her shoulder as one animal brushed against her, nearly knocking her to the ground. Still, she held on. Finally, Caleb forced his horse through the moving wall of cattle and reached her. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the edge of the herd just as another wave of animals thundered past. They stumbled clear together, both breathing hard. The calf trembled in Clara's arms. "You could have been killed," Caleb said, his voice low now. Clara looked down at the small animal, its sides heaving as it tried to recover. "It would have been trampled," she answered quietly. Rain poured down harder as the storm finally broke across the plains. And in that moment, Caleb understood something about Clara that no words could explain. She wasn't just stubborn. She was brave. By evening the storm had passed across the plains, leaving the land wet, quiet, and heavy with the smell of rain. Dark clouds drifted slowly east while the last pale light of sunset faded behind the distant hills near Abilene. The herd had finally settled. After hours of guiding frightened cattle through mud and wind, Caleb Turner managed to bring the animals together in a low draw where they could rest safely for the night. Their breathing filled the cool evening air while they grazed quietly on the damp grass. A small fire burned again at the edge of camp. Across from it sat Clara, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. The storm had soaked her clothes earlier, and though they had dried somewhat by the fire, the long day of work had left her body aching. Her left shoulder throbbed where one of the cattle had struck her during the stampede. She tried to hide the pain. Every time she moved her arm, a sharp sting ran through the muscle. Still, she kept her expression calm, not wanting Caleb to think she regretted her decision earlier. Caleb noticed anyway. After spending days riding beside someone, a person learned the small details, the way they moved, the way they favored one side of their body, the tiny signs of discomfort they tried to hide. Without saying anything at first, he walked over and handed her a cloth dipped in cool water. "Hold it there," he said quietly. Clara looked at him with slight surprise. "It'll swell worse by morning if you don't." She hesitated only a moment before pressing the cloth gently against her shoulder. The cold water eased the pain slightly, and she let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They ate their supper in silence. Nearby, the calf she had saved earlier lay curled beside its mother. It looked small against the large herd around it, but it was alive, and every now and then it let out a soft bleat. Clara's eyes drifted toward it several times. Eventually the fire burned lower, and the quiet of the plains returned. The sky above them cleared again, revealing thousands of bright stars. Caleb leaned back slightly, watching the embers glow. "Why didn't you leave town sooner?" he asked after a while. Clara stared into the fire. For a moment she didn't answer. Then she spoke softly. "Because I kept thinking someone would change their mind." Caleb frowned slightly. "About what?" "About me," she replied. The words were simple, but they carried a deep weight. She continued slowly, choosing each sentence carefully. "I thought if I waited long enough, someone would see that I wasn't worthless." The fire cracked as a small piece of wood collapsed into glowing coals. "They said I failed at being a woman," she added quietly. For the first time that night, Caleb looked directly at her. The statement angered him more than he expected. "You believe that?" he asked. Clara shook her head slowly. "No," she said after a moment. "But they did." The wind moved gently through the grass around them. "People decide things about you," she continued. "Once they decide, they don't want to see anything else. It's easier to keep believing the story they made up." Caleb reached down and pushed the embers with a stick. "They're fools," he said firmly. Clara gave a faint smile. "That doesn't change what they think." "No," he agreed. "But it changes what I think." She looked up at him in surprise. Caleb held her gaze steadily. "You rode straight into a stampede for something that wasn't even yours," he said. "You work harder than most hands I've hired." He nodded toward the calf resting nearby. "That's not failure." Clara swallowed slightly. "Then what is it?" she asked. Caleb answered without hesitation. "Courage." The words settled quietly between them. Clara looked again toward the small calf sleeping beside its mother. "I just didn't want it to die alone," she said softly. Caleb understood that her words meant more than the animal. Later that night they lay down in their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fading fire. The cattle breathed slowly in the darkness while the stars stretched across the endless sky. Clara stared upward, feeling something strange growing inside her chest. It wasn't shame. It wasn't fear. For the first time in a long while, it felt like possibility. Morning came quietly across the plains. Soft golden light spread over the land as the sun rose above the distant horizon near Abilene. The storm from the night before seemed like a distant memory. The sky was clear again, and the air carried the fresh smell of wet grass and earth. Around the camp, the cattle began to stir. The small calf that Clara had saved during the stampede let out a thin bleat. Its mother answered immediately, nudging it gently as it struggled to stand. The animal was still weak, but it was alive. Clara watched the moment quietly while sitting beside the fire. When Caleb Turner woke, he noticed that she had already rebuilt the fire and started the morning coffee again. The small routine had become familiar between them during the long days of the drive. Neither of them mentioned the storm or the conversation they had shared the night before. But something had changed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simply there, like a quiet understanding growing between two people who had spent enough time riding side by side to recognize each other's strength. After breakfast, they continued driving the herd north. The ground was softer now because of the rain, and the cattle moved more slowly through patches of mud and damp grass. Clara's shoulder still hurt from the blow she had taken during the stampede, but she kept riding without complaint. Caleb noticed her small limp whenever she dismounted, though she tried to hide it. Around midday they stopped near a narrow creek to rest the herd. The cattle spread out along the water to drink and graze while the two riders finally stepped down from their horses. Clara walked toward the creek and knelt beside the flowing water. She cupped her hands and splashed the cold water across her face, letting it wash away the dust and sweat from the long ride. When she stood again, Caleb was beside her. "You're limping," he said quietly. I'm fine, she answered. You're not. Clara sighed slightly. It'll pass. Caleb studied her for a moment. Then he did something unexpected. He reached gently for her arm and carefully examined the bruise spreading beneath the sleeve of her dress. His hands were rough from years of ranch work, but his touch was careful. You don't have to prove anything, he said. Clara met his eyes. I'm not proving anything. Then what are you doing? He asked. For a moment she searched for the truth inside herself. I'm staying, she said. The words surprised even her slightly, but once spoken they felt right. Why? Caleb asked. Clara didn't look away. Because you didn't look at me like I was something broken. The quiet creek flowed beside them while the herd grazed peacefully nearby. Caleb cleared his throat and stepped back slightly, as if the conversation had come too close to something he wasn't ready to name. They finished the drive 2 days later when the rail station appeared in the distance. Smoke from a waiting train rose into the sky as workers moved around the livestock pens. After guiding the cattle into the pens, Caleb counted them carefully. 79 had made it safely. 1 had been lost during the storm. Still, the drive had been successful. After the cattle were sold, Caleb received the payment and counted the money carefully. Then he separated Clara's wages and held them out to her. 4 weeks, he said. You earned every dollar. Clara took the money and looked toward the railroad tracks stretching into the distance. A train would soon depart heading east. She could buy a ticket and start over somewhere new where no one knew her past. Instead, she folded the money and placed half of it back into Caleb's hand. I'll take half, she said. The rest buys feed for your stock. Caleb frowned slightly. You earned it. I know. She stepped a little closer. You asked me once why I stayed, she said softly. I didn't know the answer then. She looked directly at him. I thought I was just warming my hands at your fire. Caleb waited. But I wasn't, she continued. I was finding my place. The noise of the rail yard faded around them. I don't have a dowry, Clara said. I don't have a town waiting for me. But I do have these hands, and I have the choice to stay. Caleb slowly reached for her hand. My ranch is 2 days south, he said. It needs work. Clara smiled faintly. Good thing I don't quit. As the sun began to set, they rode away from the station together toward the open land. For the first time in years, neither of them felt alone.